So here we go with art from around late 50s into the 70s. Um, we must start with pop art, which I think most people think Andy Warhol created, which he was not the first to kind of create pop art. This is by Richard Hamilton, and it's called um, what is that makes today's home so different, so appealing? It's from 1956. It's collage, and it's actually considered to be the first kind of reference to pop art. It has to do with actually, I know people think it's only just popular, but it also has to do with the Tootsie Pop that's in here. Hamilton has put together a lot of different kind of representations of culture in the 50s and put them kind of in a way that makes people question or uncomfortable with it. So you do have the jazz singer that's going on back here, which is actually the first talkie that was actually also had blackface in it. And then down here you have this woman who's got the domestic, sphere, kind of all the new technologies that are kind of making life easier at home, like vacuuming and things like that. Everybody's getting televisions in the 50s in their houses. These kind of romance, cartoon, graphic novel type stuff become really big. But you still have, all of these things kind of happening at once. This is, this Tootsie Pop role is in a comedic positioning. You have this kind of woman, I think, with pasties on, who's just kind of sitting here with a lamp on her head. This is all kind of what is going on in the world today, and why is it all together kind of incongruous and a problem. So it's poking fun. Pop art pokes fun at what modern society is doing or raises questions of it. Here's Roy Lichtenstein, and this is called Hopeless. That's the way it should have begun, but it's hopeless. He did these giant pictures of kind of that pop graphic novel stuff that we were talking about, graphic stuff. This is actually hand painted and oil. It's not. I think a lot of people think his stuff is prints, and it's not. And when you go up, you see all the little tiny dots that you would have seen that would have been printed in those books. And he paints them all himself, and he takes like iconic scenes or makes it feel like you're in the middle of this kind of drama. Here's Andy Warhol. Here his Coca-Cola bottles are kind of the start of his work towards this reproduction. Warhol had been in sort of graphic design for commercial, so for like advertising and stuff like that. And he forayed himself into kind of more of an artist and critiquing things. He started in Pittsburgh and he moved to New York City and started something called the Factory, which was a group of artists who were, in film, cinema, but they were also in sculpture and poetry and all sorts of things. And they lived pretty kind of wild and crazy lives. Warhol was actually known to both support and bring in new artists, but he also sort of destroyed things too. Warhol himself did not use drugs or alcohol, but a lot of the people around him in the factory were kind of had their lives kind of destroyed through heavy use of drugs and whatnot. So just understand that Warhol's sort of a complicated figure because he encouraged these artists to kind of live wild lives, didn't do it himself, and then would film it. And here he has, this is, him looking at kind of everybody's the same, but a little bit different. This kind of goes along with the process. This is oil on canvas. This is not a print. So that's something also to understand, is that he did have a lot of artistic skill in that regard. Here's his Maryland diptych, very, very famously done. And so it kind of shows this like, the classical diptych that you see in art history, think about in churches and stuff like that, triptychs and diptychs. But here you have this celebrity, this cult of celebrity, and how kind of shiny and beautiful she is here, but then she kind of is fading away. This is a 6 foot by 5 foot silk screen enamel on canvas, and he uses oil and acrylic in it. So it's a very kind of big critique on celebrity and fame, which is one of Warhol's big obsessions. This is Claes Oldenburg. It's lipstick on Caterpillar tracks. So this is in 1969 during the height of the controversies over the Vietnam War. If you think about like dressing, putting a lipstick on a pig, it's sort of Claes Oldenburg would take objects together and sort of mix them up in ways to make you kind of question things. So this is kind of looking at war, and whether or not the U.S. government or everybody kind of was trying to put lipstick on a pig with this. It was a critique of Vietnam War. Here we have Nikki St. Phal. This is Black Venus, 1965 to 1967. It's painted polyester and it's 9 feet high. You can see it at the Whitney. And this is really a celebration of Black womanhood in the body. She uses kind of these like iconic colors on the bathing suit of the 60s. So it's kind of like bright colors, and there's like a big heart, and flowers and love, and kind of celebrating the body and kind of the beauty of womanhood. I think she might be holding. Is she holding a little balloon up there? And so that's something kind of this is all part of the same time during the post-civil rights movement. So civil rights movement, remember, it starts really in the late 40s, 50s into the 60s, and it sort of kind of shifts. But this is definitely about celebrating Black beauty. This is Chuck Close. And so one thing that a lot of people don't know about this is that they look at it and they think it's a photograph. It is not. It is a self-portrait of himself done with acrylic on canvas. It's called super realism. So with photography, documenting people, there were some artists, and abstraction going super far abstract. There were a group of artists that wanted to see if they could paint better than a photograph. And so Chuck Close was one of the first people that did that. He later then used photography to kind of break up people. And also he's also very famous for he will make a portrait out of little tiny paintings that sort of kind of obscure. If you look really close, but you back up, you can see the whole person. But this is a painting of himself. A lot of you guys liked Dwayne Hansen, so here is Dwayne Hansen Supermarket Shopper. There's a bunch of Dwayne Hansens around, but there's a couple at the American Art Museum. So if you're downtown in Chinatown, you can go in there and see them. They're kind of interesting. They really are commentary on like everyday life in America. They're pretty complicated to make. They're polyester, resin, and fiberglass. Polychromogene oil with clothing, all the things. The museums are allowed to restore and possibly replace objects in it. He has allowed that. So, because sometimes people try and steal stuff from Dwayne Hansen's stuff, and sometimes some things fade because what he's created isn't necessarily always stable in the way that like we know about paintings and colors and things like that. But they're very interesting commentaries, these like still scenes of humans doing daily human activities. And the longer you look at them, you can kind of wonder about what his commentary is, or what that person was like, or what they're doing. He's making you stop and look at humanity. Judy Chicago, this is the dinner party. This is sort of like a major when this work happened. It was sort of this kind of major turning point in feminism. This is a table, and at it are some of the most famous settings for the most famous women in history, variety of philosophers and leaders and various things. And she has on the plate kind of imagery that is shaped like vaginas. And so this is supposed to be a celebration of the female body as well as the female mind. Written on the floor are a bunch of other people that would be there too. So the idea is if you brought some of the most kind of the strongest women in history to a dinner party, these are her Judy Chicago would have. And then this is how she would set the table for them. And so it's inviting women to the table that they hadn't been invited to. This is the 70s when women, had gotten the right to vote, but really were not welcomed into the workplace, and really were not welcomed into any sense of equality. So she's kind of bringing women to the table here, very famously. There's also a renewal of using like fiber arts and different kinds of arts. Folk art becomes a little bit more popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the realization that like the mainstream art gallery world isn't the only way. And so some famous artists actually also, like Miriam Shapiro, borrowed things from like quilting and things like that to kind of bring different styles. This is fabric and acrylic on canvas. Another famous feminist artist was Cindy Sherman. She did untitled film stills. So she would dress herself up. So that is Cindy Sherman right here, but as from famous scenes in movies. And so that's how she became really famous. So she has like, there's a series of them where she did that. She's also done a series where she looked at like pornography stills and kind of did like mannequins. She's done like a whole variety of stuff. Actually, presented a couple papers on her. She's very fascinating, but she does not like to be pictured as herself ever. So she tries to kind of dress up and use photography to create scenes and moods to get the viewer to think about the position of these people. And she has a whole series where she dresses up as like famous artists. Like there's one of her as Caravaggio in Caravaggio's famous paintings and things like that. So she definitely kind of has a sort of like a play of humor as well in some of her works. I wanted to kind of highlight some shifts in architecture that happened during this period. People are no longer only looking at high rises or only looking at like mid-century modern contemporary spaces. They're also trying to think in the round and what that all means. This is the Guggenheim that Frank Lloyd Wright did in New York City. Highly recommend going to the museum. It has a round spear. It's sort of like the Hirshhorn, but that the exhibit is on the almost on the stairwell itself, and you kind of can go in at times. It creates a very different kind of experience, particularly very different from the architecture around it. Le Corbusier, which you guys might recognize a long time ago from the previous video of Villa Savoy. And here we remember this piece we were talking about, everybody moving up to the second floor, being one with nature, and the open spaces, and all of this kind of stuff. Well, he also redefine a church from 1950 to 1955. They make this Notre Dame smaller kind of church, and it really goes back. If you think about the early churches we were talking about in the Christianity, it sort of kind of goes back in that way, and uses kind of very flexible kind of clay-like walls and creates a more modern church. So you can compare and contrast this with maybe a cathedral, and you can have a very different experience about people and experiencing the church. Additionally, the Sydney Opera House is important. It's really quite stunning. You can actually, when I studied abroad in Sydney, you could take like a little of a, what do you call it, an air thing. Okay, now you can laugh at me. Just imagine we're in the classroom, you're laughing at me, and see an aerial view of it. But it's along the harbor. It's supposed to be like the waves that come in, and the wind and the waves that come in from the harbor. And the interior also takes all this design into play. So if you go into the opera house and you see it, it's kind of very modern and has cool acoustics because of the way that they chose to do it. You have continuation, things like the Sears Tower of trying to get higher and higher. You have some interesting kind of shifts. This is Michael Graves, who's sort of famous for making domestic objects now, but he got famous for this architecture. It's kind of faux Art Deco that was popular in the 80s. The Pompidou Center is in the 70s. The Pompidou Center was considered to be incredibly offensive to the French when it was made. It's in the Marais, which is kind of a fun district. And they took out they basically took out the walls, and they put everything that was inside the walls on the outside. So a lot of French people thought it was like the underwear showing. But people have gotten used to it, and it actually is kind of a really cool space to kind of see, and it looks at things very differently. And finally, you guys learned about Spiral Jetty this summer, but Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty was a site art that became very popular, environmental art. So he set up this like the spiral that went on, and it was like jettied out from the side here. And it was in Utah, and it slowly over time has disappeared. And actually, you can if you can look online, and there's current and later updates of Spiral Jetty. And so his art kind of dissolves with time. Well, this is surely not all the art from the 20 years, but it's sort of a good like window into what exists. I really wish I had the opportunity to take you guys to a modern art museum. Maybe we can meet up later together to do that. Okay, that's it for modern art.